Hello YouTube, this is Fan76. Now this is a bit different than what I normally do, but it's a video I've wanted to make for a very long time, and I sort of did, but kind of didn't at the same time. So I'm finally coming back to revisit it. The original gist of it is favorite plane, the DC-10. A video came out and it sucked. If you want a bit more of an emotional context, go watch the original video. It'll be in the description. But here we're going to go through, in depth, the more fundamental flaws of why this video absolutely sucks and fails at supposed journalism as Iilluminaughtii has tried to be. So, on February 10th, 2022, Iilluminaughtii uploaded a video called Death Plane, the Severe Incidents of DC-10's Corporate Casket. Corporate Casket, of course, being her little series exposing MLMs and other shady practices in corporations and dealings and whatnot. Now, before the entire Iilluminaughtii drama went down, I was very vocal about my disdain for this video, and I don't think we should stall anymore. Let's go ahead and get into the reasons why.
The DC-10s were designed with the purpose of luxurious air travel in long-distance flights. However, what started out as luxury was quickly overshadowed by the lack of safety.
Right off the bat, I already take issue with this statement. While, yes, the DC-10 had a rather bleak reputation with the public, that is a very generalized way of putting what's to come and what's to be talked about. And we'll get to that.
From the beginning, these planes were disastrous in the sky, eventually leading to hundreds of deaths and dozens of serious accidents.
I don't like that wording, from the beginning. That implies the plane always was and is a failure, when that is absolutely not the case. While it did lose the jumbo jet race to the 747, for obvious reasons, it absolutely was not a failure of a plane, and in fact, later on in this video, I'm going to be explaining why a lot of the perception of the plane is wrong, and how the plane is actually much more successful than everybody thinks.
What went wrong with these planes, and were they really as dangerous as they seem, or were they simply a product of their time?
Keep this question in mind that she poses. We're gonna come back to this. Skipping ahead, generic introduction stuff.
And today we will be discussing the serious incidents of what has been called the death plane, the DC-10.
She calls it the death plane as if that was its nickname. However, who called it a death plane? I wouldn't doubt that certain individuals did, but she says this as if it was a well-established fact that, oh, everyone called this the death plane. Could you provide some context or some evidence of any kind that a lot of people or a significant amount of people called it a death plane, or did you just hear this from word of mouth and just run with it?
Just as a quick warning, due to the nature of this episode, death is discussed multiple times throughout. If this may be a little too much for you to hear right now, please feel free to skip this episode, and we'll see you in the next one.
This is tangential to the topic at hand, but I find this trigger warning highly ironic given what's come to light about her. I'm going to be skipping ahead a little bit in the video, as the first part of this video covers the McDonnell Douglas Corporation, how they came to be and all that, and I don't take too much issue with this. Not at all. I think this part of the video is actually well done and summarizes the events pretty well.
Now, before we get into the multiple instances of tragic crashes and other incidents associated with this new luxury jet in the 1970s and 80s, I just want to talk a little bit about what air safety was actually like around this time.
I don't have a lot to say on this part, as I do also believe she does a good job explaining what airline safety back then was as well. In fact, I'd argue this is probably the best part of the video. And I think it does the question she posed earlier some service, as it gives a foundation to, hey, what are the factors we're working with here? And that's good. That's a good thing, because you need to consider all the factors when making a claim. Unfortunately, I can't say the same about the rest of the video, and we will be getting to that very shortly.
Wright, a training pilot, said that pilots in the 1970s had an extremely high workload and the planes weren't as animated as they are today. So tired, overworked pilots often had to make quick decisions by themselves in times of crisis.
While I understand the sentiment she's going with here, the thing is, that's just what technology of the 1970s was. We didn't have a lot of high-tech, fancy, quick calculating computers at our disposal back then. And it was, yes, it was very much so up to the human pilot to make all the decisions, and they were trained as such as well. While I don't inherently think this is a bad claim to make, I think it's a bit misleading, especially for the narrative she's trying to go for here. Skipping ahead the video even more, she talks about life insurance and the life insurance kiosks that were in airports in the 1960s. In my opinion, she goes on a little bit too much of a rant when covering this point, but that's just me, and I could be completely wrong on that. And that's not even the point of this video.
So, traveling in the sky in the 60s, 70s, and 80s definitely came with its risks, and the safety was nothing compared to what it is now. But unfortunately, the DC-10 seemed to either be incredibly unlucky, cursed, or just poorly designed.
This is a terrible point to make, especially if you are trying to answer the question, were the DC-10s actually death planes, or are they just a product of their time? If this was posed as a question to the viewer that would be left up to the viewer to answer, then yes, this would be perfectly fine, but it's not. For a video that's supposed to be getting down to the bottom of a nickname of an aircraft, all we've had so far is fear-mongering on the issue. And we haven't even begun to discuss the serious incidents of the plane itself. The entire point of this video is to go out and explore, does the DC-10 deserve this reputation? Which, no, it does not. And I'm sorry to say, but it's only going to get worse from here.
And had over 50 serious accidents in its 3 decades of flying, including crashes, hijackings, and 1 bomb on board.
This is misleading as well. If you were to take this at face value, you would think, oh my gosh, this plane had a lot of terrible accidents, that must not be safe. But if you actually take a step back and look at the bigger picture, and then take into account all the factors surrounding these incidents, including the nature of the accident itself, how long the plane has been flying, and how many operators actually, well, flew the plane, compared to other aircraft, that is actually a rather marginally small number. Especially if you look at the 747, which many still fly today, and, well, just take a look at this stat sheet from Wikipedia. The last DC-10s were retired just this year, and comparing that stat sheet to the 747 has exponentially more accidents and fatalities than the DC-10. In fact, even on the DC-10's own page about accidents and fatalities, the page itself says the safety record exponentially increased after the first few flaws in the 1970s. But we're skipping ahead a bit.
While I obviously don't have the time to discuss all of the incidents experienced by the DC-10s over the years, let's get into some of the worst.
Oh, okay. So that means we'll be covering American Airlines Flight 96, National Airlines Flight 27, Turkish Airlines Flight 981, Continental Airlines Flight 603, American Airlines Flight 191, Western Airlines Flight 2605, Air New Zealand Flight 901, World Airways Flight 30, United Airlines Flight 232, and Federal Express Flight 705. All on a consecutive timeline, and to get to the bottom of the question and find a reasonable answer, right? Right? And so we begin our descent into madness. Right off the bat, again, who is calling it the death plane? Everyone now calls it the death plane, but that's just because of this video.
The first major incident with the DC-10 happened only 2 years after it took its maiden voyage in 1973. On a National Airlines flight, one of the engines exploded. When it blew up, a piece of the engine broke a passenger window, causing one of the passengers to be sucked out of the aircraft through that broken window.
This is an incorrect statement. The first incident of a DC-10 was American Airlines Flight 96, which occurred on June 12, 1972. In that case, the cargo door blew out, but the plane and everyone landed safely. If she had phrased this as the first death on a DC-10 flight, then she would be correct, but she didn't, so that's an L on her part. And I find it very odd she started with this one instead of American Airlines Flight 96.
The National Transportation Safety Board reported 2 years after the incident that the engine's fan blades had contacted the fan case during flight, which caused the engine to explode. Despite this horrible accident, I didn't find any sources that mention any repercussions in this incident to the airline or the plane manufacturer.
Okay. This statement is just blatantly wrong, and if she had done 3 seconds of research onto how aircraft manufacturing works, she would know that the aircraft manufacturer, McDonnell Douglas in this case, is not responsible for the assembly of the engines. That would fall on either the manufacturer of the engine, they would have the blame placed on them, or the maintenance of the airline themselves. And given the fact that she just said she couldn't find any blame placed on the airline, I'm going to assume that it's a manufacturing fault. To say that you couldn't find any blame to place onto the plane is a very odd and asinine statement, especially for a video aiming to find if the plane itself deserves a bad reputation. This really hammers home what this video is actually about, and it's trying to find any kind of blame to place onto the DC-10, which is highly ironic given the question posed earlier. I told you to remember it. And you will see, especially later on, it looks like the narrative she's going for is to not answer the question, but to, again, fearmonger this thought, this seed of doubt about the integrity of the plane itself, all just for some kind of dramatic narrative. Is that good journalism?
Only 1 year later, there was another severe DC-10 incident. This time, it was due to a faulty cargo door. The DC-10 had previously had problems with their cargo doors before this tragedy.
Here, she does talk about American Airlines 96, but it does this weird timeline jump, I can only assume for either brevity's sake or just to tell the story of the type of incident together? I don't know.
In 1972, a DC-10 was flying over Ontario, Canada when the cargo door suddenly blew open. The cabin of the plane lost pressure and the floor collapsed. Cydia Smith, the leading flight attendant, said she was lifted off her feet by the explosion while she was making the passengers coffee during the flight. Miraculously, the pilot was able to keep control of the jet and landed the plane safely in Detroit with no major injuries to the crew or the passengers. It was later discovered that the latches were designed poorly, which led it to open mid-flight, and it was recommended that they be modified. But despite this knowledge, nothing was done to actually fix the issue.
Hoo boy! The infamous discussion of the DC-10's cargo door. We're going to be discussing this in further detail in a hot minute, but right now I would like to discuss what was just said in the video. So, the way that this was worded, the latches were designed poorly, which led it to open mid-flight. While the way the wording came across might not have been the intention, the door did not open mid-flight, and the latches did indeed fail, but this caused the door to blow out, not open. Open implies any kind of intention by any design. As a counterpoint, take a look at United Airlines Flight 811, a Boeing 747 flight bound from Los Angeles, California to Sydney, Australia, with intermediate stops in Honolulu, Hawaii, and New Zealand. What happened to cause that disaster is that the Boeing 747 had a design flaw in the circuitry with the cargo door, whereas even if you didn't tell it to open itself, it would sometimes, unprompted, open itself. And that's exactly what happened on this flight. A short circuit caused the door to get the signal to open, so it did, but the resulting explosive decompression forced the door upwards and then ripped off a chunk of the fuselage, sucking out 8 people in the process. What actually happened, and I don't know why it's only briefly glossed over in the video, is that the baggage handler had forced the door closed due to a fault in that mechanism. For context, these cargo doors opened outward to allow more cargo space, and as such, needed internal reinforcement to keep them locked shut and prevent them from blowing outwards to the difference in air pressure. But even with the meticulous design of these cargo doors to ensure that it didn't blow out, the wiring was too small to deliver enough power most of the time to activate these latching hooks. There was supposed to be a pin that physically prevents the baggage handler from latching the door shut if the latches weren't properly, latched, and there was a hole for these pins to slide through, but it was found this failsafe, failed, as the latching bar controlling these pins could buckle if enough force was applied, which wasn't a whole lot. Another failsafe also failed, as the valve meant to visually warn of the improper lock, and a cabin warning light system were also bypassed. The pins, while not in place, still triggered the valve to mostly close, and the cockpit warning light to deactivate. If anything, this gripe is mostly minor in a factual sense. Comparing this to the disaster of United 811, the key point is that, yes, both doors failed due to a design flaw, but the way presented on American 96 was incorrect. And that pales into comparison what she says next, immediately right after that.
And there were no recalls of the DC-10s, and they continued to build more with the same faulty latch.
Recall an airplane? How do you even recall an airplane? You don't. That's the answer. That's never happened in the history of aviation. Even if something major, like a design fault, is discovered and needs to be immediately rectified, you would ground all models of that type and have mandatory rebuilds enacted. But more on that much later. I also have one more thing to say regarding the nothing was done to fix it issue, but we'll loop back to that.
This would come back to haunt the DC-10s multiple times.
Multiple times? No.
On March 3, 1974, the latch would open on a plane again, this time causing massive damage and hundreds of casualties. The plane was a Turkish Airlines McDonnell Douglas DC-10. According to History.com, before the plane was meant to take off, the latch had not been inspected as it was required to be. The mechanic, who was meant to do a visual inspection of the door, was out on vacation, and the flight engineer apparently forgot to assume this duty. This would turn out to be a disastrous mistake. When the plane reached an altitude of 11,000 feet, the door blew off, only 9 minutes into the flight. This caused 6 seats in the back of the plane to be sucked out along with the people sitting in them. Unfortunately, the door flying off caused the flight control cables to be severed, and the pilots were unable to control that plane. It crashed in the Armenonville forest in France only 90 seconds after the doors blew off, killing 346 people in total, including all of the crew and passengers.
Save for the previous gripe about the cargo door coming open, I don't have a whole lot of gripes about this section, and I think it's done well for the most part. But that praise soon wavers.
Despite the company being made aware of the faulty latch door in a previous incident, the manufacturers blamed baggage handlers for failing to properly secure the latch. Even if that were true, and despite someone forgetting to check it, the fact remains that the company was aware of this issue and never did anything to fix it.
Yes and no. I'm not going to beat around the bush. McDonnell Douglas was hecking responsible for this and American Airlines Flight 96. But mostly this. While it is true that the crew somewhat failed to do their duties, McDonnell Douglas is to blame because they did know about the faulty cargo door, but they did not do nothing about it as she's trying to push in her narrative. It should be noted that McDonnell Douglas did implement a change in the cargo door, however, by adding a peephole in the door for baggage handlers to check the lock, and an instruction plate in both English and Turkish explaining the peephole, and a service bulletin had also been issued to enact cargo door modifications by way of installation of a support plate for the handle linkage, preventing the bending of the linkage seen in the Flight 96 incident. However, on the accident plane, this was not done, despite paperwork from McDonnell Douglas claiming otherwise. Now, it's impossible to tell if this was intentional fraud or a critical oversight, but the fact of the matter is that these revelations were pretty damning for McDonnell Douglas. Something that Iilluminaughtii got right in this video is, yes, McDonnell Douglas did try to place the blame, or some of the blame, onto Mohammed Mahmoudi, the baggage handler who operated the door, and Turkish Airlines, especially since it was found that the airline had modified the cockpit warning indicator on the cargo door to deactivate after the closing lever was pushed in. On top of that, Mohammed didn't use the peephole to check if the locks were in place. Though the blame on him didn't really stick, as it was learned that there was no way he could have known what the peephole was for. He couldn't speak English or Turkish, let alone read it. It was also found that baggage handlers operating on DC-10s all over the world didn't even know what the peephole was for in the first place.
The blame placed on baggage handlers by the company actually caused them to boycott all DC-10s. It wasn't until a spokesperson from McDonnell Douglas apologized that they returned to working on that plane. Following an investigation regarding the crash, the FAA issued an airworthiness directive, which forced McDonnell Douglas to finally modify all of their DC-10s that were currently in service.
Something I'm rather shocked she didn't go about is not only the 1970 tests of the cargo door showing that they were essentially faulty from the start, the Applegate memorandum detailing how it was faulty, and then basically how the gentleman's agreement between the FAA and McDonnell Douglas after the Windsor incident, American 96, prevented an airworthiness directive from being issued just because McDonnell Douglas wanted to save face with their plane. I'm surprised that none of this was mentioned, especially in whatever narrative she was trying to push. Did she or her team, because I know she has a team of researchers, did neither of them look into this deeply? Did they just find an article and just look at it surface level? Even on the Wikipedia article it states all of this. In the Mayday episode she used clips from at the beginning of this video, it states that just outright. Where are those details?
Then, the company lost an $18 million wrongful death lawsuit to the families of the victims of that crash. This crash remains the deadliest to take place on French territory, and it is the 4th deadliest accident in the history of civil aviation.
It's especially confusing because this is the exact lawsuit that all of these details were revealed in Discovery. Like, you would think you would want to include that in your documentary about how the DC-10 was supposedly a death plane? I would like to pause here for a moment and preface that while I am defending a bit of McDonnell Douglas here, they were most definitely at fault for the accident, and they should have done a whole lot more than they did to fix the issue. But the blame should be shared, rightfully so, because the aircraft manufacturer cannot control what the airline does with their fleet, and despite McDonnell Douglas putting out a service bulletin to repair the issue, or to try to fix the issue in this case, Turkish Airlines failed to do so. But that shouldn't take away from the fact that McDonnell Douglas did still try and undercut the underlying issue. A final note on this issue, it should be noted as well that the FAA also got a bit of the blame, as they shouldn't have let the agreement go through in the first place.
The DC-10s would go on for a couple years with no incidents.
This is incorrect, as on March 1st, 1978, Continental Airlines Flight 603 had one of its landing gear tires blow out, damaging the landing gear, causing the plane to veer off the runway, and subsequently causing a post-crash fire that killed 2, and then 2 more would die later as the result of their injuries. The tires were found to be substandard, and different tires would be mixed together, therefore causing a blowout. Basically, it was a freak accident. The tire itself was worn down, it didn't have the right tolerance to handle aircraft landings, but there was no rules or regulations in place at the time because it wasn't thought that this was an issue by anyone. Subsequent changes were made, and aircraft tires eventually became standardized for each plane. So the too long didn't listen of that is, no, the DC-10 itself wasn't his fault, nor was McDonnell Douglas.
But another tragedy occurred, this time on American soil in 1979.
Breaking in for a hot second, she is right that news and reception of the DC-10 simmered down, and it basically just became another plane in the skies up until this point.
Flight 191 took off from Chicago O'Hare Airport and was meant to land in Los Angeles.
Another personal gripe, but I don't know why you show an MD-83 instead of a DC-10, especially when I found the exact photo of the plane taxiing right before the disaster.
While the plane went down the runway and reached takeoff speed, the left engine broke off. The cockpit voice recorder caught one thing at this moment, the pilot saying, "Damn, this would be the last thing captured by the recorder." When an aircraft controller saw the engine break away from the plane, he radioed and said, "All right, American, 191 Heavy, you want to come back to the runway?" Unfortunately, there was no reply.
I don't mean to keep breaking in because I'd rather let this entire segment play out before I give my thoughts on it, but this is something I want to interject on. I don't know why she didn't use the actual ATC recordings because they exist. They're on YouTube. You can listen to them. I have them downloaded right now, actually.
Look at this, look at this. Blew up an engine, equipment, new equipment, he blew an engine. Oh. Yeah, right by that guy. All right, American 191 Heavy, you want to come back into what runway?
Going to skip ahead a little bit more here for the sake of brevity and for copyright purposes, but what she goes over here in this section is the disaster and how it unfolded. We'll just go ahead and skip to the part where the investigation comes into play.
So, what happened? Days after the accident, the Federal Aviation Administration issued orders for all carriers to inspect DC-10s with a particular focus on an area where the engine attaches to the wing.
Breaking it again to say that she has the context clue, but she doesn't use it. You'll see why in a sec.
A night shift mechanic for United Airlines said, "I just had the feeling there was something not right. When he went to inspect the plane, he pushed on the engine and it moved side to side rather than up and down. He also heard an unusual metallic noise when applying pressure to the engine. Sensing that something was wrong, he and his coworker removed panels and found damage in the engine, including fractures and bolts with the heads sheared off." American and Continental Airlines also found damage on the DC-10s when they completed their inspections. Due to this, the FAA ordered that all DC-10s be grounded only 12 days after the horrific incident.
And now we get to one of the real issues I have with this section of the video. For American Airlines 191, she gets most of the details correct. However, she fails to bring up that this incident, the grounding of the DC-10s in 1979, is what gave the public perception of the whole death plane narrative and why people were afraid to fly on a DC-10 or refused to get onto a DC-10. In fact, something I'm extremely confused on as to why she didn't include was the media coverage of American Airlines Flight 191, as 2 photos of the plane flying on its side before the crash and then the crash explosion itself were both published in newspapers all across the country, only to help further garner a negative reputation for the DC-10. I don't know if Iilluminaughtii forgot to find it, or if she didn't include it, or her research team just failed to find it. Whatever the case, it's inexcusable that this isn't included for a video with the sole purpose of finding the narrative of what the hell is wrong with the DC-10?
They remained grounded from June 6th to July 7th. According to the National Transportation Safety Board, the disaster of Flight 191 could be traced to cut corners and poor maintenance inspections by American Airlines. The McDonnell Douglas instruction manuals required maintenance to remove the engine and the pylon that connected the engine to the wing during safety inspections. However, they were not doing this because not doing it saved around 200 man-hours per aircraft.
She gets the gist of the disaster correct here, though she fails to mention the whole issue about American Airlines, Continental Airlines, and United Airlines using forklifts to reassemble the engine pylon back onto the wing itself. She then goes on a mini rant about corporations prioritizing money over safety, which... true.
This again comes down to one key and continuous issue with corporations. It's profits over people.
You would think that would provide a good narrative to use that, hey, maybe the plane isn't so bad after all, maybe McDonnell Douglas isn't in the wrong here, and maybe this whole name death plane is exaggerated.
The FAA also required that DC-10s make improvements to their pilot warning systems and revised manual procedures for handling an engine failure.
Of course it wouldn't be! What's the title of this video? Why would I ever think otherwise? This statement by itself is true on a surface level. However, since Iilluminaughtii makes no mention of how the simplified repair procedure specifically caused the crash, and as such had absolutely nothing to do with any manufacturing fault of the plane itself, the tone and context of how it's presented try to paint McDonnell Douglas, and by extension the DC-10, in a negative light. On top of that, even referring back to Continental 603, McDonnell Douglas had followed all of the required safety guidelines laid out at the time, and such a situation was unheard of and not required until it happened. You can't blame someone for not following a rule or guideline that doesn't exist. Safety and safety guidelines are created on the foundation of new faults discovered. How was McDonnell Douglas supposed to know that airlines would try and bypass such an important step to disassemble the engine pylon in a very specific way, and that the results of said step would cause such a situational disaster? And yet, the tone of the video's narration tries to have you believe that McDonnell Douglas was still somehow responsible.
But this unfortunately was not the only crash for the DC-10s in 1979. Another took place on November 28, 1979 during a sightseeing tour in Antarctica. Air New Zealand had been doing sightseeing tours for over 2 years, and they were massively successful. The captain flew the plane through the clouds and below 2,000 feet to offer his passengers a better view. But unfortunately, due to the minimal clarity, the pilot could not see the mountain ahead of them. When the proximity alarms finally went off, it was too late for the pilot to change course, and the plane plummeted into Mount Erebus, killing 257 people.
Once again, I'm going to have to skip over a majority of this, both for brevity's sake and for copyright purposes, but she goes over the crash of Air New Zealand Flight 901 and the resulting conspiracy to blame the pilots of the disaster. She gets this right, but at the same time, she fails to bring up yet another crash that happened in 1979 involving a DC-10, and I'd argue is also important to bring up because the fact that the CVR was released, and it's nightmare fuel?
We're cleared on the right. We're cleared on the right. Is that it right? No, this is approaching the goddamn left. Yeah, find the E500. No, yeah. Oh, get up! Oh, Jesus Christ! Get out!
So, yeah, I don't know why she wouldn't bring that up.
While this crash was not the fault of the plane itself, I bring it up to show that sometimes the DC-10s were simply, for lack of a better words, at the wrong place at the wrong time. And not all of the incidents of the aircraft's record were the fault of the faulty designs associated with the plane.
We've only had one faulty design of the plane itself, and that was the cargo door, but we got that done and out of the way, then what's the point of bringing this up? What faulty designs? What other design of the plane was faulty in your context of a narrative?
Just because I mentioned hijacking earlier, I will say that there were DC-10s that experienced this too. On a flight from Rome to Paris, a plane was hijacked by a single person. This caused the flight to make an unscheduled stop in Geneva, Switzerland. While there, the hijacker shot a passenger, and that passenger ultimately was killed.
I don't know why she doesn't bring up the name, but it's Air Afrique Flight 56.
While DC-10s did experience some wrong place, wrong time type situations, they definitely had some situations related to faulty design and poor maintenance, as I mentioned earlier in the crash in Chicago in 1979 and the Turkish flight in 1974.
The way this is phrased makes it seem like there's going to be another incident she's going to talk about where the plane design itself is at fault, or McDonnell Douglas. I'll answer that question now. No, because she talks about United Airlines Flight 232, and oh boy, I have something to say about that.
And unfortunately, another massive incident took place again in 1989 because of an engine.
For God's sake, the engine isn't the fault of the plane or the plane manufacturer. Are you intentionally using misleading wording?
While Flight 232 was en route to Chicago, an engine exploded and the hydraulic lines were severed, which caused the plane to lose flight controls. Without those controls, the plane started to turn and was at severe risk of turning upside down.
Terminology, it's called a bank angle.
But the pilots were able to eventually gain at least some control of the plane. Despite the fact that this type of issue had happened multiple times on a DC-10, there were no backup plans for a DC-10 with total hydraulic failure.
This line makes me irrationally angry, so I'm gonna hold off until the end of this segment to talk about everything wrong with this entire part.
But since there were no hydraulics, there were no brakes, so the landing was far from soft. When the plane hit the ground, it exploded and caught fire.
Again, there's the actual video, ATC, and CVR recordings up on YouTube. Use them!
Keep full off of it, you'll lose it. That's what's turning you. Okay, back out. Left, Okay, all right, one more. There he goes. All right, engine 3, engine. All right, engine, come over here. Come on, get his head on you. He's going to go up the dock. And so all of them come in the same body. I'm going to tell you, I'm going to the thing.
Because of the rapid response by rescue teams, 184 of the 296 people who were on board were saved. Unfortunately, this means that 112 people lost their lives.
Of course she focuses on the death count instead of the fact that landing the plane at all, even at getting it to an airport, was a freaking miracle. It isn't called the miracle landing for no reason. It doesn't have that high of a survivability for no reason. The fact that Captain Haynes, Denny Fitch, and the other two were able to even get the plane on the ground close to any kind of rescue is a miracle in itself, especially given the circumstances. Or the sky being clear that day, or a shift change at a hospital nearby, or the fact that the National Guard was training there. None of those factors apparently matter in this narrative. I literally wrote the script for Fascinating Horror. Why do you not do your research on this? Are you that hellbent into trying to push your death plane narrative?
After the investigation, it was discovered that the engine had a crack in it, which caused the explosion.
No. The disc fan inside the engine assembly itself had the fault, had the crack, not the engine, the disc fan. It was made of titanium, of a titanium alloy that had an impurity caused by an air bubble when it was cast back in 1971.
Nothing happened to the McDonnell Douglas Corporation because of this flight.
I think this clip right here perfectly sums up the purpose of this video in its entirety. It's not out to set out to answer the question of, hey, is the DC-10 actually a bad plane? No, it sets out to scrounge up any and all reasons it can to reaffirm a predetermined narrative that doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you take 3 steps back and actually think about it in greater detail, which this video fails to do on so many levels. We're at the end of the United Airlines 232 segment, so I'm going to loop back to an earlier point she mentioned that I said I was going to come back to, and talk about the hydraulic issue. What made this hydraulic failure unique is because it was caused by the failure and disintegration of an engine, which was unheard of in the industry. The FAA themselves at the time said that total hydraulic failure in the event of an engine disintegration was completely impossible and unheard of. So when it did eventually happen, that's why the entire flight was called the impossible landing / the miracle landing. The situation was thought to be impossible, no one had a solution for it, and nobody thought you could survive from it, and yet many did. That's why it's also called the miracle landing. You can't fault McDonnell Douglas or the DC-10 for a fault that was previously thought to be unknown, was unregulated, and hadn't happened up until that point in time. That's completely asinine for any kind of journalistic integrity you're trying to build up here, especially on such a topic. One last thing I'd like to mention on United 232 is that the plane itself was actually commended for having such a sturdy construction, therefore contributing to the high survivability. How do you miss that when you're trying to answer such a question?
The DC-10s remained in commercial use until 2014 when it took its last commercial flight. but they are still actually used today as cargo planes.
I should mention here that at the time of this video's release, this was indeed a true statement. However, on January 15th, 2023, FedEx retired the last of their DC-10 fleet, thus marking the end of the DC-10 era.
A plane enthusiast, Gordon Stretch, interviewed by the BBC, said it was important to mention that of the 446 DC-10s built, a relatively small number were involved in fatal crashes. He told the BBC that there have been high-profile crashes for every type of aircraft, and went on to say, "I wouldn't say the DC-10 was an unsafe aircraft. There was a specific problem, and the maintenance procedures at the time weren't up to speed." Another man, Chris Yates, who is an aviation expert, said that the DC-10s were unfairly criticized during their tenure. He said, "There were some pretty horrific accidents a number of years ago, and ultimately it was grounded for a while. But then it got back in the air, and it was all go, really." Multiple people within the BBC article said they had a positive outlook of the DC-10 and hoped it would be remembered as a plane that helped pave the way for distance flying.
Well, there you go. There's the answer to the question we've all been waiting for. That's it then, right? The DC-10 wasn't so bad, right? Right?
Now, I'm obviously not trying to scare anyone with any of these stories about horrific accidents on a plane.
I'm inclined to disagree.
But what do you think? Were the DC-10s death planes, or simply misunderstood and a product of their era?
I think you need to stick with your pyramid scheme and MLM videos, because if you're doing this piss poor of a job talking about a plane and its supposed death reputation, how am I supposed to believe you're able to talk about anything else competently? I'm sure your research team does a good job, but good God, if they're at fault, if you're at fault, I don't know, and quite frankly, I can't bring myself to care anymore, because after watching this video, I have no faith in the ability to really get your research and facts straight. And of course, given the whole drama situation revolving Blair, Iilluminaughtii, whatever, I'm even less inclined to believe that she's able to change. But I digress. So, that was the worst plane video I've seen so far, not including everything that 74 Gears reviewed. Seriously, go watch him. He's much more competent than Iilluminaughtii. If you want a better video on the DC-10, go watch the video made by Mustard. He did an excellent job covering the DC-10, is very factual, goes in more in-depth than Iilluminaughtii ever could on the plane, and it's overall just an enjoyable watch. That's all I really have to say on this matter. It's something that I've wanted to make for a long time, but just never was able to find a way of doing it until now. I just want to remind everyone, if you've made it this far, thank you for watching, and despite what I said here and whatever else, don't go out of your way to harass anybody involved. I know Blair is a terrible person to be around, but don't, harass her team, her fans. Just don't go out of your way to hurt anybody. This video is entirely for educational and entertainment purposes, and just to correct some misinformation that's spreading around on the internet. In any case, thank you for watching, and I don't know when I'll do another one of these. They take a heck of a lot out of me, but I'll try my best next time it happens, and see you on the flip side.